I found a journal belonging to my great-great-grandfather. It's the most terrifying thing I've ever read. I'm 23, a history student in a small college town in the US. History fascinates me, especially war stories. My grandfather recently passed away after a long battle with stage 4 leukemia. We were close, incredibly close. He loved sharing his stories from Vietnam. A few days after his funeral, I received a package. Dear Mr. Thompson, enclosed are a few items your grandfather wanted you to have. Inside there was a leather-bound journal and an old World War I dog tag. The letter said, "Jack, this is something I never told you for your own good. Grandpa." I hesitated, then opened the journal. Journal of Private James Holden, 2nd Battalion Western Front, October 5th, 1917. They say the war will end soon, but I've heard that lie before. The trench is as it always is, mud up to our knees, rats gorging on the dead, the stench unbearable. Tonight the fog rolled in thicker than ever. Corporal Davies swore he saw movement out in no man's land. "Something's there," he said. We laughed it off, but none of us truly believed it. Even the guns seemed hesitant. October 16th. Something happened last night. Willoughby, a young lad barely out of training, vanished. He was on watch with me. Without a word, he dropped his rifle and climbed out of the trench. He disappeared into the fog. Hours later, he came back. But it wasn't him. His uniform was torn, his skin grey as ash, and his smile too wide, too unnatural. We shot him. We had no choice. Even then, he kept moving. It took a bayonet through the chest to stop him. We buried him at dawn. No prayers, no ceremony, none of us could look at his grave. October 19th. The whispers started last night. At first, I thought it was just the wind. But it wasn't. Corporal Davies swore they were calling his name in his mother's voice. "Come home," she whispered. I heard it too, my sister Mary. She's been dead for years. None of us are sleeping. The men, they won't even speak. October 24th. We're cursed. You're listening to Ghast. If you enjoy lying awake at night, questioning every shadow and sound, join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Hit subscribe to ensure you never miss a terrifying tale, leave a comment sharing your own brushes with the unknown, and don't forget to like this video. It helps other seekers of darkness find us. And now, back to our story. Davies tried to leave. We found him at the edge of the trench, staring into the fog. It took 3 of us to pull him back. He fought, screaming about the light and the voices. By morning, he was dead, his body ice cold, his skin pale as death. The whispers, they're louder now. Shadows move in the mist, but when I look, they're gone. It's October 30th. No one is left, only me. The trench is silent, except for the whispers. They're not just around me anymore, they're inside my head. The faces of the dead watch me from the mist. I can feel the cold in my bones. They're calling me. And now, I think I'll go. I closed the journal. My breath shallow, my heart pounded in my chest. This shouldn't have been possible. It made no sense. I staggered to the window, looking out at the fog rolling in, a common sight this time of year. But then, I saw him. Grandpa. Standing in his combat uniform, his skin grey as ash, his smile too wide through the fog. I saw his mouth moving, whispering, "Join me." My grandfather was an exceptional man. Born in crushing poverty, he took to a life of crime in his teenage years before straightening up and joining the British Indian Army, where he served with distinction. After India's independence, he won multiple national-level gold medals in wrestling, completed his education, and started a successful trucking company. He had lived such an extraordinary life that he spent his old age reliving his memories with friends and family through his great storytelling skills. Us grandkids loved to sit around him as he regaled us with tales from his well-lived life. He always seemed so joyful when he did it. But there was one story he avoided telling until he was almost on his deathbed. One story that has stayed with me, even after all these years. I remember it all like it just happened yesterday. How his eyes widened, how his bony hands trembled in fear as he recounted the most frightening experience of his life. Thankfully, I had a tape recorder close at hand, and I can tell you what he told me, in his exact words. "Are you sure you want to record this? Because it's not very pleasant." Okay then. Just don't tell your mother what I tell you here. I don't want to be held responsible for any nightmares you might end up having because of this. So all this happened back in 1942, in the midst of the Arakan campaign. The Japanese had pushed all the way into Burma. Myanmar. The campaign was the first offensive push by the Allied army to push the Japs back. And let me tell you, it was a spectacular failure. We were not prepared for the attack. Remember, this was back when Indians couldn't rise above the rank of Subedar Major, and all command posts were occupied by the British. And they had no idea what they were doing. Our transport infrastructure, our supply lines, were pathetically weak. Hell, Bengal, that was supposed to be the launch pad for the invasion, suffered a devastating famine just a year later. I'm sure you must have read about that in school. The Japanese, on the other hand, were well fortified and carried out ambushes on a regular basis. Entire patrol squads would get wiped out in the blink of an eye. The attackers would suddenly appear out of the shadows and disappear before help could arrive. It was terrible. We were on edge all the time. Every branch that snapped, every leaf that rustled, got our fingers pushing against the trigger of our rifles. Compounding all that were the harsh conditions. We were far more likely to be killed by disease than war. The food we ate, barely enough to keep us on our feet. The threat of malaria and dysentery always loomed large. Snakes, spiders, and insects larger than anything we'd ever seen crawled over our emaciated bodies as we slept. Swarms of flies, dark little clouds, descended on the corpses of our brothers. It was hell. We were permanently covered in layers of dirt. Rains lashed the forest at an alarming frequency, turning the weather so humid it felt like our skin was starting to melt. Repeated spells of rain pretty much destroyed our communication lines. The ground had turned so boggy that some soldiers got stuck, right up to their thighs. It was so bad that command structures completely broke down. Disorganized chunks of the army operated almost independently from each other. It was in such a situation that nightmare appeared in our lives. One of the worst aspects of fighting in the jungle was the psychological warfare. The Japs would kidnap our soldiers, torture them for information, and brutalize them beyond anything humanly acceptable before sending them back, barely clinging to life. But that wasn't the worst of it. You see, one thing they delighted in doing was using our soldiers as bait. They'd torture a man to the brink of death, tie him to a tree in a clearing and wait. If we went out to save him, they picked us off from the trees. All we could do was stay hidden, listen to the agony-filled death throes of our brothers, until the last drop of life was slowly squeezed out of them, as they cried out for their mothers. It was one such incident that changed everything, or at least, it looked like one of those incidents. James Wavell, a distant relative of Archibald Wavell, the then Commander-in-Chief of the British Indian Army, was in charge of us. He sent us out on patrol that day. There were about a dozen of us cutting through the jungle when we heard the screams. You see, in forests, it's hard to track down the source of a loud noise. It feels like it's coming from everywhere, like the woods themselves are speaking to you. But this time was different. Instinctively, almost on a primal level, we knew where the screams were coming from. It was as if something deep in our bones urged us forward. It didn't take long to find the source. The man, dressed in Indian Army fatigues, but his shirt torn, hanging in tatters. He was tied to a tree, his hands pressed desperately against his stomach, holding something that shouldn't have been there, and his screams, even now, I hear them echoing in my mind, sharp, full of anguish. They were so full of pain, it almost felt like I could feel it too. Without thinking, I started moving toward him, but just as quickly, a hand grabbed my shoulder, pulling me back with force. I turned to face the man who stopped me, his eyes, wide, alert, filled with dread. He shook his head slowly, silently warning me. We spread out into the woods, guns drawn, eyes scanning in every direction. But there was something else, something deeper than just fear of the enemy. The man's screams, their intensity, began to twist my gut in a way I couldn't explain. It was wrong. We weren't just afraid of the Japanese hiding in the trees, it was the wounded man that haunted us. I can't explain it, but something inside me screamed to run, to get as far away from him as I could. I took position a little to the left of the man, waiting for the inevitable. For the moment his cries would stop. But they didn't. Minutes bled into hours. The sun began to set, but he kept screaming. We stood there, frozen in place, unable to look away from his agony. The moon rose, casting a cold light on the scene, but still he didn't stop. My legs ached from standing too long. I could hear someone nearby crying, but we couldn't move. It was as if time had frozen. We were all trapped in a nightmare that wouldn't end. And then it happened. The screams stopped. The world around us went completely still. It wasn't just quiet. It was a silence so profound. I could feel it pressing against my eardrums. There were no birds, no insects, not even the rustle of leaves. It was as if the entire forest had held its breath. Then the man stood up, with a strength that seemed impossible. He tore through the ropes binding him and stood tall, even though his body was in tatters. I could see things I shouldn't have seen. He had no right to be standing. No man could live through something like that. I swear I froze when his gaze locked with mine. There was something in his eyes, something dark, unnatural. It was like he knew me, like he knew exactly where I was. And when he looked at me, I felt the weight of an unspeakable malice. He opened his mouth. And what came out wasn't human. It was a scream, a high-pitched wail that seemed to shake the very trees around us. My heart stopped. I started to back away, but it was too late. He was already moving toward me, faster than I thought possible. His strides were long, unsettling, and he didn't seem to feel the pain that should have stopped him. I ran. I didn't think. I just ran. I left my gun, my backpack, everything. I ran through the thicket, stumbling in the dark, my boots slipping in the mud. I could hear his footfalls behind me, his breath heavy, getting closer. Every time I looked over my shoulder, he was gaining. He was smiling, like he was enjoying the chase, savouring the hunt. I could hear the others behind me, their screams cutting through the night. One by one, they were falling. And I knew it was only a matter of time before I would be next. My lungs burned, my legs screamed in protest, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't outrun him. But maybe I could hide. I found a small crevice under an uprooted tree, a dark corner where I could slip away from view. I squeezed into the tight space, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't care about the darkness or what creatures might be hiding there. All I cared about was getting away from him. I heard his footsteps, slow, deliberate. Then the sound of him whistling. It was soft, almost gentle, like the song of a bird. The eerie melody made my blood run cold. I pressed my hands against my helmet, closed my eyes, and tried to breathe as quietly as I could. And then he called to me. In my mother's voice, it was a soft, loving whisper, one I hadn't heard in years. She'd passed long before that night, but his voice was unmistakable. He called my name, and when I didn't answer, I could hear the quiet chuckle that followed. I didn't dare move, I couldn't. It was over. I was sure of it. But strangely, he didn't come for me. He left. I don't know when exactly, but I didn't hear his footsteps anymore. I spent the rest of the night there, alone in the dark, too terrified to move. When the sun finally came up, I was still hidden, trembling. Another patrol found me in the morning. I couldn't even speak. They had to carry me back. I was exhausted. My body was wrecked. But I was alive. That was the closest I came to that thing. But that wasn't my only encounter with it. All throughout my stay there, I heard stories about it. From my own regiment and others, even the enemy soldiers had supposedly run across it. This immortal thing that imitated voices, pretended to be wounded, and tore apart entire squads at a time. Or how it came to you in the quiet of the night when you were lost in sleep, a dark presence whispering fear into your thoughts before pulling you into a place of dread, where you felt yourself break. Some patrols reported unsettling signs of our comrades' fates. Strange markers left behind, figures arranged in ways that didn't make sense, as if something beyond our understanding was at work. At one point, we feared we were losing more men to this unseen force than to the enemy. I'm sure they felt the same. All the horrors I witnessed in that land, the relentless bombings, the sickness, the overwhelming loss, were nothing compared to that night. I remember the immense relief when we finally reached Rangoon. Even amidst the noise and chaos of battle, all I could think of was that I was thankful to be away from that cursed place.